Now it's green. Okay, now we're good. Yeah, y'all can hear me better now, right? So they started rebuilding the temple. They got discouraged and afraid of their enemies, and they stopped working on the temple. Many years went by, and two prophets came along, encouraged them to get back to work on the temple. And that's Haggai and Zechariah. And so they did, and they finished the temple in year 516 BC. And we got through Ezra 6, and we studied Haggai and Zechariah. So we're stopping at Ezra 6, and we're going to study for the next 4 classes the book of Esther. Because what we're doing is we're going through the Bible chronologically and following the flow of the story. And so we will get back to Ezra after we finish the book of Esther. So I'm really excited about this because Esther is just such a practical and interesting story. I don't know if it's as practical, but there's a lot here for us, as I'm going to point out. And so here's the title that Brian and I gave, and we always try to make it memorable: Extermination Avoided. So you think of the E of Esther, think of the word extermination. So the Jews were going to be destroyed, but that was avoided, and that's kind of the overall message of the story through Esther, who became queen of Persia, right? So the events of the book of Esther fit between Ezra chapters 6 and 7. There's about a 60-year gap between those two chapters, and this story fits within that 60 years. And so we're going to be in Esther 1 through 4 this morning as we talk about the Jews in danger of extermination. And here's the main takeaway that I'm going to point out this morning. The Lord works in mysterious ways. That's a popular, saying. We've all heard that and used that before. In this book, we see God's providence. We don't actually read the word God anywhere in this book. God's name is not mentioned, but His word is evident throughout. And so we're going to be emphasizing the providence of God this morning. So chapter 1, let's dive right in. In verse 1, it says, "Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus." I say that, I think, wrong. That's the way I used to pronounce it. I'm going to say it Ahasuerus. I think that's better. "The Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 120 provinces, 27 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. This is a 6-month feast. So this man, Ahasuerus, actually is Xerxes. Ahasuerus is his title. This is the son of Darius the Great, who we've been talking a lot about. And we kind of know a little bit what he looks like. Here's his profile here. And I mean, it just helps to make it real, And so visualize this guy. He's got this big beard and pretty nice looking fella. And it mentions there at the end of verse 2, Susa. Susa. That's where the citadel was. And that's also where the palace was, where the king would live. And we know what that palace looked something like, because there are still remnants of it left behind. And here's a reconstructed drawing of what it would have looked something like. Again, just to make this real. The 3rd year of his reign is mentioned there in verse 3 as the beginning of when this story starts. That would have been year 484 BC. To give you some point of reference, the temple was rebuilt in 516 BC, a little over 3 decades before. So that was the last thing we studied. The temple was rebuilt, so about 3 decades, a little over, have gone by the time we start the story of Esther. So we're right in midway in the 60-year gap between Ezra 6 and 7 as we start the story of Esther. Verses 5 through 9 talk about this 7-day feast that is kind of the grand finale of this 6-month feast. And I mean, it's just over the top, and a lot of money is being spent, and there's a lot of luxury everywhere, and a lot of wine and people getting plenty to drink. And then we're introduced to the queen. What's her name? All right, Vashti. In verse 9, she gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. And so, things are about to turn sour really quick. Verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, now keep that in mind, he's drunk, that he commanded these 7 different men, these 7 eunuchs, verse 11, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. Now, I'm going to skip some of the discussion questions that I had planned just for sake of time. Whatever you might think about this command of the king, I'll give you my take on it. He's drunk. He's commanding his wife to come show off her beauty. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that's something fitting. And in the next verse, she refuses to do it. And how does that make him feel? He is furious about that. All right? And I'm getting a little ahead of me on the slides. So, as we continue in verses 12 and following, or verse 13 and following, the king has a conversation with his leaders. And he asks them, what do you think I should do about this? My wife, she just disobeyed me right out here in front of everybody. Well, according to the law, what should be done? And what was basically the response? What was recommended that he do?
Set her aside.
Get rid of her. Not kill her, but right? Get rid of her as queen. And what else?
Get somebody else.
Get somebody else. And what else? There was also something else that was recommended.
And a decree.
A decree. And the decree would basically tell everyone that the king is doing this. And the fear was, if something is not done, all the women in the land are going to think that they can disobey and dishonor their husbands. And so let's make sure we send out this decree so that, as verse 22 points out, that every man should be the master in his own house. And so my feeling on this is a good example of an abuse of the idea of a man being the head of the household. I preached about, last Sunday, I preached about that, Ephesians 5, 25 and 26, that women are to be subject to their husbands in everything as the church is subject to Christ. But the next thing that I said was what the next verse says, which is Christ loved the church, and husbands are to love their wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And when we think about leading as husbands, we have to lead in such a way that is with love and with consideration of her needs and consideration of what is appropriate in God's eyes. So, we could go into a long discussion about that, but I want to kind of bring us back to the main idea that I want to emphasize today, which is the Lord works in mysterious ways. So, here we have the unfolding of the beginning of this story. The ball is now rolling, right? And at this point, it doesn't look like God's really doing anything. I mean, this is an arrogant, worldly king who makes a ridiculous command of his wife, and she refuses, so he's going to get rid of her and replace her. I mean, par for the course, right? I mean, what's very unusual about that? But God is working in this, and He is in His providence using the free will of these people to help to bring about something big and momentous. The Lord works in mysterious ways. He certainly does. Now, any questions or thoughts about that chapter? I know we breezed through that before we move forward. Chapter 2. So, as this chapter starts, some time passes, and one of the officials of the king says, why don't we go ahead and let's start finding a new queen for you. And the suggestion is, let's go and find all the beautiful young virgins of the land, bring them before the king, and let you choose which one you really like. Well, any worldly king, he's going to like that a lot. So, yes, of course, that sounds great. Then we are introduced to two characters, Mordecai and the main character, Esther. So, verse 5, now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. So that's talking about Kish, this ancestor of Mordecai, had been taken back in that captivity. The second phase of the captivity, when Jeconiah or Jehoiachin was taken captive. Do you remember what year that was? So the first phase of the captivity was in 605. Then the second phase was in 597. Yeah, 597. Okay, so good. So he is a descendant of that man that was taken captive, this Mordecai. Right? Verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So his uncle's daughter would make her his first cousin. Apparently she was a much younger first cousin. It says, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So Mordecai raises his first cousin. He takes care of her as his own child, and he is like a father to her. Just a side note, Hadassah would have been Esther's Hebrew name. It means myrtle, an evergreen shrub. Her Persian name was Esther, which apparently, and there's some debate about this, apparently means a star. You can even see the root of like the word astrology in the word Esther. So like Venus, as they would regard that to be a star, indicating beauty and good fortune. All right, continuing. Verses 8 through 11, Esther is one of these women that are chosen to bring into the king's harem. And she finds favor in the sight of Hegai. I didn't say Haggai. Hegai, with an E and with one G instead of Haggai. He is one of the eunuchs, and he's in charge of the women and everything. And she just finds favor in his eyes. He provides favors for her. He puts her in the best place of the harem. And verse 10, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Interesting question, and I'll take some comments here. Why do you think, and we don't know, but why do you think Mordecai commanded Esther not to make known her people or her kindred? Have thought about that? Any thoughts?
The fact of the matter is that the Jews are a small portion of most populations on most countries on the face of the earth.
Okay.
But because of that, and because they are so smart, believe me, the Hasidic Jews, their bell curve is about 90% in the 90th percentile. And so they are successful at business, and God blesses them sometimes, certainly if they succeed that well. And that's why people get angry with them. What happened here when what's his name? I forget the guy's name that was talking about all the Jewish-owned businesses in the black neighborhoods.
Well, that's an interesting thought. Okay, so sometimes the Jews, even back at this time, didn't maybe have the best reputation. So maybe that's why. All right.
Just simply not to have any kind of bias.
Okay.
If she's unknown,
Yeah.
there's no bias that can be had against her, whether jealousy or envy or whatever.
Good. Here's what some commentators suggest, and I don't know if this is true, because as one country guy said up in Monticello, Florida, commentators are just commentators. We can't necessarily take what they say and bank on it. But I thought that he was so country. He got up in one class and he wrote that on the board. He said, "You know what commentators are? Commentators. That's what they are." So that's right. But anyway, what a lot of them suggest about that is that, Mordecai knew that if it's known that she's a Jew and who her kindred is, then obviously he's her kindred, and he would be elevated to a high position artificially, just by being related to her, and that in his great humility, he did not want to be artificially elevated in that way. I don't know. We just don't know, but it's interesting to think about. So let's kind of continue here. So verses 12 through 14 talk about the process of beautification for the women. How long did they have to prepare before going before the king? An entire year. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. So, husbands, next time you think your wife is taking too long to get ready, just remember this passage. A whole year. And then finally, they would be brought before the king, one at a time, presented before the king, and he would decide, how he feels about them. and they would never go back before him unless he called them by name to do that. So it became turn for Esther to go before the king, verses 15, 16, and she doesn't try to impress beyond what she is recommended to take with her. They could take anything they wanted. She doesn't take all that other stuff that a lot of these other women probably took. She just took with her into the harem, into the presence of the king, whatever was recommended by Haggai, and she is just found in favor with everybody who sees her. And she goes before the king, and what does he think about her? Love at first sight, right? She's going to be my queen. So she is actually made queen. Here's this random Jew, this kind of nobody that now is all of a sudden queen to the most powerful man on the planet at the time. I mean, we have so many stories like this in the Bible of people that God raises to such a high status, like Joseph, we were talking about in my Lord's Supper talk. I just want to mention this as a side note. We know this is year 479 at this point in the story because of verse 16 tells us it was the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So we started the story in the 3rd year of his reign. This is the 7th year of his reign. So that gets us to 479 BC. And let me just throw a couple of things in here that I think are interesting. I don't know if they help the story, but they're really fascinating and faith building, and I'll show you why. So first thing we need to realize here is the king had, previous to this, he had been away from Susa. He had been out fighting battles, and he fought with the Greeks and had a victory in Athens, and he burnt the city. And he destroyed the Acropolis, and he destroyed the temple of Athena. And this is history. This is you can go on Wikipedia and find this stuff. In fact, that's where this picture comes from. And so, but then after that, he suffers a couple of pretty crushing defeats from the Greeks, and he kind of comes back to Susa with his tail between his legs. This is when he returns back to Susa, that then Esther is made queen. And from this point forward, he really embarks on a vigorous building program, if you will. And I mean, he has visions that are much larger than what his father had of what he wants to create. Huge, magnificent structures, such as this gate of Xerxes that you're looking at. Just phenomenal. This is the Apenada Palace in Persepolis, Iran. And again, just look at how grand it was. And this is what's left behind of the palace of Darius the Great that Xerxes' father, Darius, had begun but not finished, and Xerxes gets to finish it. So these are the projects he will be undertaking throughout the rest of our study of the book of Esther. Okay, just kind of put in perspective, the reason this is faith building to me is because it reminds us this is not a once upon a time story. Esther kind of reads like that kind of a story. This is history. This is a real person. These are real people, real places, real events. All right. So let's continue. Verse 19 and following, we learn about Mordecai saving the king's life. Mordecai served in a position, it says he sat in the king's gate. That probably means he had an official capacity working for the king. He found out about a plot to kill the king by these two who were guards of the door, Bigthan and Teresh, and he hears they're going to they want to kill the king. So he tells Esther, who tells the king in Mordecai's name, but nothing is done for Mordecai to award him. But it's recorded. The event is recorded, right? And that ends chapter 2. And again, let's think about God's providence here. We have these things that might seem kind of random. You have this Jew who becomes queen. You have Mordecai who saves the king's life. Are those things connected at all? If you were in that story, you wouldn't have been able to know that they were connected. But God was orchestrating these things in His providence. Sometimes in our life, there might be things that are happening that are seemingly random and don't seem to have any connection. And maybe you don't know till later, and you look back and you go, hey, those things were connected. God kind of brought those things together for a beautiful purpose. So it's a really fascinating study into the providence of God. Any thoughts on chapter 2 before we move forward? Jason?
I think you pointed out that Mordecai didn't receive a reward or anything, but the event was recorded. And, you know, he might have been in his own head going, well, I just saved the king's life. Why didn't anything happen? But that act is going to impact him later on. So like he said, God has a time and a place for that act to come back to Mordecai's benefit.
Yeah.
So we never know, like you said this morning, the Lord's up talking here, we never know what God has intended by something that happens to us in our life.
Yeah, and again, Joseph, we talked about Joseph. Remember when Joseph was in prison, and when he gave the fulfillment, the interpretation of the dream of those two who were there, and one of the interpretations for one of those men was he was going to be put back into the position that he was. And he said, make sure and tell the king about me. And what happened? He forgot. Until later when it came back up. And so we kind of see that same thing here in this story. Later, this is going to come back up in the story. But again, if you're living this story, you don't know what's going to happen with that down the road. All we can do is in the moment do the right thing. Right? Mordecai does the right thing here. Not for any other reason than just doing the right thing. And life just goes on normal. But you never know how those things are going to come back later in life for a bigger purpose. And God recognizes them.
I kind of see a smaller thing in this story as well in chapter 2, and that is when Esther goes in to see the king, they make a point of saying that she only brought in what Haggai recommended. So I envision it as she is almost this young lady of restraint in the eyes of the king. And it's almost a lesson to young ladies now. Be a young woman of restraint. Don't overdo things with your attire or your makeup or your hair or whatever. Be a young lady of restraint, and this is how you're perceived as the beautiful one.
Yeah, absolutely. And be a person who adorns yourself with godliness, as Peter talks about in 1 Peter chapter 3. You know, not to try to be showy and in every way and shape and form in the way that you dress, but to let what people recognize about you be the inner person of the heart, right? And so maybe that's what was recognized too. She wasn't trying to flaunt herself in such a way as to just catch everybody's eye. She was just kind of herself. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, great thoughts. Well, let's move forward because we still got 2 more chapters to cover. And chapter 3, as we start here, we are introduced to this man named Haman, and he's bad. He is bad news. Verse 1, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. So here's this Haman, and everybody's bowing down to Haman, all the other officials, and they're paying homage to him, almost like he's a god, you know? And he likes this, you know? He's like Herod in the New Testament that just, you know, really loved it when people were praising him as a god. And we're not told that they're honoring him as a god, but this is the kind of thing you do toward a god. You bow down. You pay homage. And Mordecai would have none of it. He's one of the officials, and he does not bow down. He does not pay homage. Kind of reminds us of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And they wouldn't bow down to the king's image. So a question that I have is, why do you think Mordecai refused to bow down or pay homage to Haman?
I think you could see that he wasn't a man of honor.
Right. Okay. Maybe he saw this man is not worthy of honor. Good. What else, maybe? Brenda?
There must have been something about it that seemed somewhat like worship in that bothered me.
Yeah. He felt very strongly about this, didn't he? Because this was courageous. I mean, this was actually maybe a little dangerous for his job and maybe for his life to disobey the command of the king to bow down. Jason, did you want to say something?
Same thing. The same reason Daniel continued to pray back in the day. it's the right thing to do, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes you just do the right thing. I don't think he wanted to give even if it wasn't wrong for him to pay honor, he didn't want to give the appearance of it.
Okay. Yeah. And I think about, in the book of Revelation, John falls down before an angel. And the angel says, I'm just an angel. Don't bow down before me. And here's a man that's wanting people to bow down before him. And I think of passages like Deuteronomy 6:13, you shall fear only the Lord your God. You shall worship Him and swear by His name. I wonder if passages like that were preventing Mordecai from feeling like he could really, in good conscience, bow down to this man. Another question, or maybe just something for us to think about. Can you name some ungodly activities that require courage for us to not take part in? I mean, it took a lot of courage for Mordecai to refuse to do it. He had a lot of integrity and courage there. What are some things in our lives that might require courage for us not to, as it were, bow down to? Anything go to mind? I don't have any answers prepared, so I'm relying on you. Jared?
There's a lot of companies that are really promoting the gay pride agenda when you come, especially to the month of June, and put out T-shirts, and they have a blood drive where if you gave blood, then you got a free pride T-shirt, and it's becoming, it's just companies are using it as a way to promote themselves, but that's becoming seen as a virtue in our society. And there's peer pressure, and you could see in the future that almost being mandatory that you participate in things like that. You get invited to go to parades to participate, and we're not going to promote anything like that. So, we would want to refuse that, but it's going to be pushed on us more and more going forward.
Yeah. That's a great example of. And you think of Mordecai. He wasn't obnoxious about, I'm not going to bow down to him. He just went on quietly about his way and just refused to bow down. And I think that's the attitude we need to have, whether it's the homosexual agenda in which there is pressure to sort of, as it were, show our respect for and our support for, and we don't have to be obnoxious about it, but we don't have to do it. In fact, we must not do it, and that's going to be really hard. There's a lot of pressure. I think that's a great parallel. Let me take Chloe and then John.
I would say, so what people call social drinking. So, when you're with friends, or even after work, people can go out for a drink, and there's the choice whether or not to go with them.
Yeah.
But then there's also the choice whether or not to drink once you're there.
Yeah.
Because there's no, I don't see harm in going with them, but then you do open yourself up to pressure from that decision.
Yeah, and you also have to consider the conscience of your brethren and everything else in the example you set. Good. All right, John, real quick.
Yeah, just to bounce off of what Jared talks about, it's not just what he was talking about, but if you look back at our country and the way we do advertising here, we have hero worship. We look at American Idol and want to be rich and famous. We worship and idolize political people, music stars, sports stars. I mean, how many jerseys are people walking around with somebody else's name on the backside of it?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So, and not that necessarily means that they're idle, but we do have to be careful. Yeah.
Too far.
Yeah.
But sometimes, we talk about, the providence of God, or what has been instilled in us at birth. Sometimes you just kind of look at this and you're going, I am not going to fall down and bow down in front of a man-made whatever. Religion, organization, politics.
Or a man or a woman in the flesh, right? Not to have that attitude of almost reverence, like.
Government said, well, God makes governments. I understand that. But sometimes governments can ask you to do things that are ungodly.
Right. Amen. Well, those are all really great thoughts. Like I said, I didn't have any answers prepared, so that was excellent and I think very helpful. But we do need to come back to our story here and continue along here in chapter 3. So Mordecai's not bowing down. And we get to verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down or paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So he is, in my mind, I think of Haman, I think of Hitler. Now, Hitler actually acted it out, but that's the desire that Haman has. He wants to literally exterminate all the Jews in the world because of his hatred for Mordecai. Can you imagine that depth of depravity that a man can have for even having that desire? But that's how terrible this man is. So we'll read in verse 7, in the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot, and remember that word, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. All right, I told you to remember because that's going to come up later in the story, not today, but much later. But don't be confused by all this in this verse. All this means is that what Haman did is, in the first year of the Jewish religious calendar, which was Nisan, he cast lots, which is maybe kind of the equivalent of like rolling dice, in order to determine, all right, what year am I going to have the Jews killed? And the cast comes out that it would be in the month Adar, which is the last month of the Jewish religious calendar. So they've basically got less than a year that he is going to try to have them killed. Right? That's the point here. And so it also mentions this is the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. That puts us at 474. So just again to put things in perspective, the king and Esther have been married now for about 5 years. Okay? And so we kind of move forward. So he goes before the king and he says, there are these people, they don't observe your laws. It's not in your interest to let them stay alive. You need to kill them all. And so he says, I am willing to give 10,000 talents of my own money, silver, 10,000 talents of silver, which is 375 tons. This man was fabulously wealthy in order to kill these people. And the king foolishly says, just openly just trusts him, okay, do as you see fit. Here's my signet ring to have the edict written, and you can stamp it with my signet ring. And so it is then determined, the edict is written, that on the 13th day of the 12th month of the Jewish religious calendar, that on that day the Jews are going to be killed. Anybody anywhere in the kingdom of Persia can murder the Jews on that day and plunder their goods. And this, by the way, would include all the returnees who had rebuilt the temple and who were living in Jerusalem and Judah. It would include them as well in this Persian kingdom. So, I mean, this is terrible. You might think it couldn't get worse than this. But again, let's go back to the big picture. God was forming these events and bringing about a glorious purpose. When we are in dark times that seem desperate, that seem like it couldn't get worse, we need to have faith that God could use this terrible situation to cause something big and beautiful to happen to His glory. We have to move forward because I only have like 5 minutes. Let's go on into chapter 4. Into chapter 4. So Mordecai and the other Jews, once they learn about this plan to have them all exterminated, begin weeping and fasting and walking around with sackcloth. And then Esther finds out in verse 4, and she the queen writhed in great anguish, as it says. I love that little phrase there. And verse 5 and following, she inquires of Mordecai through a messenger. His name is Hathach. What's going on? Like, can you tell me more of what's going on? And he tells her everything. He tells her exactly what Haman had planned, how much money was involved, and gives her a copy of the edict itself. And so now she is well aware of what else is going on. Then this is where really this whole class has been leading to, is these next several verses. I'm going to read starting in verse 9. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter, so that he may live. I forgot to mention an important piece to this story, and that is Mordecai asked her, please go before the king so that you can save our lives. So this is her response. She says, and I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. In other words, if I go, I'm going to die. You have to be summoned by the king. So they related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Two questions for y'all. Number one, why do you think Mordecai was so confident that God would deliver the Jews in one way or another? Somebody who hasn't answered, do you have a thought?
God had said he would preserve his people, that the Messiah was going to come out of that people. And if he didn't go with them, it couldn't happen.
Okay. So do you think Mordecai knew about, the promises to Abraham? And the promise that he would have a descendant who would bring a blessing to the whole world? And promise to David that this king would reign forever, that would descend from David, and so forth? Of course he knew of those. So maybe that's the reason. It's very obvious he is a man of great faith. Right? Any other thoughts to answer this question? All right, well, I got another question for you then. How can we be more open to God's providence like Mordecai? I mean, Mordecai doesn't know how this story is going to turn out. He's not a prophet. He doesn't know for sure that this is God's providence, but he says, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. He is open to God's providence and seeing, you know what, maybe God put Esther in the position of queen just for this very purpose. How can we be more open to God's providence like that? Let me start with somebody who hasn't answered. I want to give everybody a chance. If you haven't spoken up, this is your chance. Speak up. Ms. B?
Look at the providence in our own lives.
Yeah. Look at what, look back, and that's when it becomes more clear, right? We look back and we see, oh, look at how God orchestrated all of that and things worked out to help you have faith moving forward. Miss Debbie?
Praying for God, pray to God to show, for you to be patient and to see how it's all,
Yeah.
I have a friend who tells me that she prays. I just say, you're teaching me something, or there's a purpose behind this.
Yeah.
Let me be patient for it.
That's a great point. Pray. Good. Herb, did you have your hand up a second ago? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. You must have been scratching your face. Mr. David?
When you talk to somebody that kind of doesn't look like they're going to accept the Bible teaching, just rely on God for you to say the right thing that may just click in their head.
Amen. Very good. Great thoughts, everybody. Well, let's prepare for chapters 5 through 7 on Wednesday. I'm really excited, so I hope everybody comes back for that and read pages 91 through 93A in your books. Thanks, everybody.